Welcome to the Cannabis Compliance Federal Updates for October 2022. I have a jam-packed update for you this month, and I cannot wait to dive right on in. All right, and no surprise, we are going to be talking about President Biden's recent announcement on cannabis and what that means for the industry, what he really said, and what that means for your cannabis business. I'm not going to be able to dive into everything, so I'm actually going to do a separate video on this, and I'll end up linking this up in this exact video when that new video is done later this week. All right, so let's dive right on into it. All right, so on October 6th of 2022, the official Twitter account of the Office of the President presented a plan through a series of tweets. The plan is detailed as follows. First, pardoning all prior federal offenses for simple marijuana possession. And what does simple marijuana possession mean? Well, it means having a small amount of cannabis on you in possession, but without the intent to sell or distribute. Those are some pretty key terms. He was also calling out governors to pardon simple marijuana or cannabis possession offenses, which some states already said they're not going to do this. And then instructing the Secretary of Health and Human Services and the Attorney General to start the process of reviewing how cannabis is scheduled in the Federal Controlled Substance Act, the CSA. As President Biden has the power to pardon any person convicted of a federal cannabis crime, his power is limited when it comes to state crimes. So the second portion of his plan is to influence state to follow the feds on pardoning marijuana offenses. The third prong of his plan involves initiating the executive branch to go through the process of rescheduling or perhaps descheduling cannabis, which he actually did not say descheduling cannabis. He said to look at the review of how cannabis is scheduled. We wrote about how this would work back in November 2021. It appears that the days of federal prohibition may be coming to an end. Expect to hear more from this group, the Green Light Law Group, which is a really great group that I get a lot of the information for these updates from. So keep an eye on this. I'll definitely go through more when there's more updates to be released. All right, and then just unpacking this a bit further, Biden calls for a review of cannabis scheduling, pardons thousands of cannabis offenses. So this article is from MJ Biz Daily, and again, just high level, U.S. President Joe Biden was hailed by the cannabis industry on Thursday after he instructed two key officials to begin a review process for rescheduling marijuana. Biden also pardoned all people convicted of simple cannabis possession under federal law, whom he said numbered in the thousands. Of a possible rescheduling, Biden said, federal law currently classifies cannabis in Schedule 1 under the Controlled Substance Act. The classification meant for the most dangerous substances. The president called on the U.S. Attorney General and the Secretary of Department of Health and Human Services to begin the process of reviewing cannabis scheduling under federal law, a move that would dramatically reshape how the U.S. government treats cannabis and the flourishing state regulated industry that has commercialized the plant. Which again, I'm not really going to dive into this during these compliance updates. I'm doing a completely separate video all unpacking this and what this truly means for your cannabis business and our industry as a whole. Okay, so let's look at this article a bit further because a lot of the cannabis industry, as the last article just said, a lot of the industry was like so excited about this. I also know that there was a lot of people in the industry that was not stoked about this because this seems like this was just a political move right before elections. So let's look at this. Edwin Rubis, who served more than 2 decades of a 40-year federal prison sentence for participating in the cannabis distribution operation, taking into account good time credit, he is not scheduled to be released until August 2032. So again, what the president said was that he was pardoning simple cannabis possession. And that means if you do not have the intent to distribute or to sell, then you could be pardoned in this whole statement that he released. But this person had a distribution operation, so they are not a part of the pardons that are happening. Rubis is one of about 3,000 federal prisoners whose cannabis-related sentences were unaffected by President Joe Biden's mass pardon for low-level cannabis offenders. A protest at the White House today called attention to their predicament, and this was on October 24th, so this was actually just earlier this week. Biden's October 6th proclamation applied only to U.S. citizens or legal permanent residents convicted of simple cannabis possession under the Controlled Substance Act or the District of Columbia Code, so only permanent residents, like citizens or legal permanent residents, not just like anyone. None of whom was still incarcerated. Although his pardons could benefit as many as 10,000 or so individuals that represent a tiny percentage of all small possession cases, which typically are charged under state law, not federal law, and Biden's action will not release a single federal prisoner. According to a 2021 report, more than 3,000 individuals are currently serving cannabis-related sentences in federal prison. The report estimated that ending federal cannabis prohibition, a step that Biden has steadfast resisted, would reduce the federal prison population by more than almost 3,000 individuals over 5 years. Quote, your recent executive order, while a great first step, did nothing to address the thousands of federal cannabis prisoners currently incarcerated in federal prison. 16 drug policy reform groups noted in an October 10th letter to Biden. Quote, while your recent executive order will help many, it will not release a single one of the nearly 2,800 federal cannabis prisoners. Although 18 states and the District of Columbia have legalized cannabis, the letter said. There are thousands of Americans who are serving long-term prison sentences, including some life sentences, in federal facilities for conducting involving amounts of cannabis that are far less than what dispensaries routinely handle on a daily basis. The moral logic of Biden's distinction between simple possession and other cannabis offenses is puzzling. He says cannabis use should not be treated as a crime, yet he is willing to let individuals like Rubis languish in prison merely for helping people use cannabis, which today is recognized as a legitimate business in most states, 19 of which allow adult use as well as medical use. All right, moving on. Biden's cannabis scheduling review, what it means for business and capital. All right, so we all know order happened on October 6th to review cannabis drug schedule classification, resulting in the biggest ever one-day stock market surge for weed stocks. For years, cannabis industry proponents have called for a litany of changes to federal law that restrict industry success, ranging from lifting Internal Revenue Tax Code 280E, which voids a broad series of normal business tax deductions for cannabis businesses, to decriminalizing the plant so institutions and pensions funds can invest in cannabis. Key here, decriminalizing, not rescheduling. But the process for changing these rules and laws are complicated, and bankers and security lawyers tell Cronin the path forward will likely take a lot more than just descheduling. Again, all these words, descheduling, decriminalizing, rescheduling, they all mean very different things. The schedule of drugs has a wide impact on federal law. It determines many drugs that can be prosecuted for possession, determine organizations over which the Drug Enforcement Agency, DEA, has oversight, and which businesses Internal Revenue Tax Code 280E impacts. If cannabis were removed from Schedule 1 or Schedule 2, Rule 280E would no longer apply, allowing cannabis businesses to assume normal tax deductions, a boon worth of hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to even the smallest cannabis companies. It would be a huge impact, but I am not for rescheduling. It's either we remove from the Controlled Substance Act and decriminalize, not legalize, decriminalize at the federal level. Again, I am not going to go into this update. That's a whole other separate video. All right, and let's add more to the confusion. Did Biden just legalize cannabis? Absolutely not. He did not. President Biden did not legalize cannabis. However, it did pardon Americans with federal charges for small amounts of cannabis, again, with not intent to distribute or resale. This move will help over 6,000 people. so stated. But it's important to note here, most small cannabis offenses are actually sitting at the state level, which we have already gone through in these updates again. So just looking at all of the confusion between what words we are using and how important the differences are between legalization, decriminalization, rescheduling, and descheduling, because it matters. And let's just, my last one, because I just need to hit this point home. Descheduling cannabis, don't reschedule it. Thank you, Harris Brickin. Okay, so just a really quick statement here from the article. So if the federal government wants to continue its policy of deference to state cannabis regulations, it should deschedule cannabis. Here, I agree. It would avoid the clash between DEA and state regulations, and it would not be that difficult to do. The federal government could do something similar to what it did with hemp in the 2018 Farm Bill by centering federal oversight in one agency by allowing states to regulate cannabis as they see fit in coordination with the federal agency. The federal government could also pass the States' Right Act or any of the myriad of other pieces of federal legislation that have and inevitably will continue to be proposed in Congress. Rescheduling cannabis and subjecting it to DEA regulation is a bad idea. We hope that the Biden and his administration can focus efforts on descheduling cannabis and allowing states to regulate it as they see fit, which will cause the least amount of friction in the industry. Agreed. All right, let's look at this article. Biden's announcement, safe banking, and the CAOA. October has been a mixed bag in Washington, D.C. in terms of cannabis policy. There hasn't been much news from Capitol Hill, but the Biden administration shocked everyone when they made the big announcement earlier this month on October 6th. As we draw nearer to the midterm elections in November, don't forget to register. Let's take a look at where things stand currently. So the Safe Banking Act, S.910, has been held up in the Senate for more than a year now. Many Senate Democrats, including Leader Schumer, have been pushing for changes in the bill to create a Safe Plus bill that includes justice-focused provisions. As with all things in politics, a delicate balance must be kept in order to reach 60 votes in the hyper-partisan Senate. Unfortunately, there's no substantive news regarding the Cannabis Administrative and Opportunity Act or comprehensive reform broadly on Capitol Hill right now. While NCIA and others continue to push for descheduling and responsible regulations from Congress, the upcoming election and Senate timeline have taken precedent. It's unlikely that the CAOA will move this legislative session given the numbers of legislative days left in the year. Earlier this month, President made an unprecedented announcement that his administrative would begin the process of pardoning for thousands of people with nonviolent cannabis use of possession convictions, simple possession, and would begin the process of working with the Department of Health and Human Services to reclassify cannabis from a Scheduled I drug in the Controlled Substance Act. It's no coincidence that when NCIA members show up in DC, big things happen. Make sure to stay informed as they head towards the lame duck session via their newsletter and social media platforms. All right, and since we're talking about regulation and the FDA, let's talk about the FDA real quick. So FDA hires cannabis policy expert. Is a new CBD regulatory framework around the corner. So FDA has hired Norman Birnbaum, an experienced cannabis policy expert, as a senior public health advisor at the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. The move signals the agency may soon develop a regulatory framework for cannabis-derived products, including cannabinoid CBD products, something that CBD stakeholders have been anxiously awaiting. In 2018, Congress legalized hemp production with the Agriculture Improvement Act of 2018, or the 2018 Farm Bill, in layman's terms of what we call it. In so doing, Congress removed hemp and tetrahydrocannabinoid in hemp from the Schedule I listings of marijuana and tetrahydrocannabinoids in the Controlled Substance Act to be considered hemp. Congress made clear that the material has to possess limited concentrations of delta-9 THC, the main psychoactive ingredient in what we defined as cannabis. Specifically, the statute defined hemp as the plant Cannabis sativa L and any part of the plant, including the seeds. Therefore, any derivatives extracts, cannabinoids, isomers, acids, salts, and salts of isomers, whether growing or not, with a delta 9 THC concentration of no more than 0.3% on a dry weight basis. So, Inter Norman, we anticipate the FDA will lean on policy experts like him to help finalize the agency's thinking on safety, manufacturing, quality, marketing, and labeling standards for hemp-derived products and hopefully bring regulatory certainty to this space. In the past, the agency has underscored that it takes an evidence-based approach to authorize new uses of ingredients in consumer goods, and we expect that to continue with his involvement. All right, another one out of the law firm Harris Bricken. TCPA litigation, an update. So for years past, Harris Bricken has regularly counseled their clients about the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, TCPA, because the cannabis industry, like many others, were being targeted for TCPA violations, which were sometimes legitimate, sometimes not. Last year, the Supreme Court decided a semi-annual case entitled Facebook versus Dugoid in narrowing the definition of automatic telephone dialing system to only those devices that generate random or sequential phone numbers that were now largely obsolete. Ultimately, TCPA litigation is still alive and kicking, so it will remain important to make sure that your cannabis businesses are in compliance. And if you find yourself facing a demand letter or worse, a complaint for allegedly violating this TCPA that's either valid or not, don't discount it and contact Harris Bricken. So real quick, what is the TCPA? It shall be unlawful for any persons within the United States or any person outside the United States, if the recipient within the United States, to make any call other than a call made for emergency purposes or made with prior express consent of the called party using an automatic telephone dialing system or an artificial or pre-recorded voice to any telephone number assigned to a paging service, cell phone telephone service, specialized mobile radio device, or other radio common carrier service, or any service of which the called party is charged for the call, unless such call is made solely to collect a debt owed or guaranteed by the United States. So, just something to keep an eye out for. All right, and then let's talk on over about hemp real quick. So, hemp policy item tabled amid concerns of meeting at the U.S. Ag regulators. So, the 2022 National Association of State Departments of Agriculture meeting is taking place this week in Saratoga Springs, New York. The meeting focuses on policy solutions to some of the country's most vexing agricultural issues. The group also votes on policy proposals, which then guide the group's advocacy at the federal level since the passage of the 2018 Farm Bill, which legalized hemp at the federal level. Hemp has increasingly become a topic of discussion as NASDA meetings. Hemp is defined as cannabis plants with 0.3% THC or less. NASDA Plant Agriculture and Pesticide Regulation Committee tabled a hemp-related action item after Keith Rogers, Chief of Staff for the Kentucky Department of Agriculture, raised concerns. Rogers moved from that item to be tabled and suggested that he would work with other state agriculture regulators on hemp policy ahead of the 2023 Farm Bill. North Dakota Agriculture Commissioner Doug Goring suggested the formation of a small work group to hammer out hemp-specific policies and called for background checks when it comes to hemp-related ag. Awesome. And if you are looking for more cannabis business and compliance information, click this video right here where I unpack more compliance updates, but for the Western states. And don't forget to subscribe below here for the monthly cannabis compliance and regulatory updates and weekly videos to improve your cannabis business. Have a good one.